The sun was shining over the busy streets, and people were going about their day, oblivious to the storm that was about to unfold. Steven Seagal, calm and composed as always, was walking down the sidewalk, enjoying a rare moment of peace. Dressed in his signature dark outfit and sunglasses, he moved with the quiet confidence that comes from years of disciplined training and experience. Little did he know, a group of cops was about to disrupt this calm in the most shocking way possible. Without warning, a police officer stepped forward, blocking his path. "Hey, you, stop right there," the officer barked, his tone sharp and unnecessarily aggressive. Seagal stopped, raising an eyebrow, his face a mixture of mild surprise and quiet amusement. He had dealt with threats, bullies, and adversaries many times before, but there was something about the way these officers were acting that felt almost comically reckless. Another officer quickly joined, and before Seagal could even respond, one of them reached out and slapped him across the face. The sound echoed down the street, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. People gasped. Phones were pulled out instantly, recording every moment. Crowds started to gather, whispering and pointing. Did that just happen? Someone muttered under their breath. Seagal, however, did not retaliate. His eyes remained calm, unflinching, and his expression gave away nothing but quiet confidence. He didn't shout, he didn't swing back, and he didn't panic. Instead, he stood tall, allowing the absurdity of the situation to speak for itself. The cops, expecting fear, intimidation, or at least a reaction, were met with an unshakable presence that only heightened the tension. Around him, bystanders held their breath, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Cameras flashed, recording the confrontation, capturing not just the slap, but the calm, almost eerie stillness of the man they had just assaulted. Steven Seagal's mere presence seemed to command attention, and the crowd began to realize this was not an ordinary man, and this was not an ordinary encounter. And in that moment, before anyone could predict what would come next, Seagal's eyes locked onto the officers. There was a silent warning there, a hint that what happened next would not be what anyone, least of all the cops, expected. What Steven did next, murmured onlookers, left everyone completely stunned. The slap had echoed down the street like a gunshot, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Bystanders froze mid-step, their phones raised to capture the shocking moment. The crowd's murmurs swelled into whispers of disbelief. People who had been walking, talking, or scrolling through their phones stopped, transfixed by the spectacle unfolding before them. But Steven Seagal remained calm, almost eerily composed. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, scanned the officers with a steady, piercing gaze. There was no anger, there was no panic. No hint of the fury anyone might expect after being publicly humiliated in such a blatant way. Instead, there was clarity. A calm readiness, like a storm quietly gathering on the horizon. The officer who had delivered the slap stepped back, clearly expecting Seagal to flinch, to shout, to push back. But Seagal didn't move. He adjusted his stance slightly, a subtle shift that conveyed both awareness and control. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, measured and commanding, not loud but impossible to ignore. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I suggest you reconsider your actions." The words, simple and understated, carried an authority that made even the toughest officers pause. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every subtle gesture, every slight tilt of his head, every deliberate breath. The energy in the street had shifted. What began as an aggressive display of power by the officers was now a tense standoff, the balance of authority subtly tipping. People around the scene couldn't help but be drawn into the moment. A woman in the front row held her phone tight, recording every second, whispering to her friend, "Who is this man? He's terrifyingly calm." Another bystander, a young man with wide eyes, muttered under his breath, "I think he's about to do something insane or incredible." Yet Seagal did nothing overtly aggressive. He simply stood, letting the tension build, allowing the officers and the audience alike to absorb the realization that they had underestimated him. The slap, intended as a show of power, had only highlighted their misjudgment. At this point, the officers began to show signs of uncertainty. Their movements became hesitant, their voices less commanding. The slap, which had been a bold declaration of authority, now seemed impulsive and reckless. They were out of their element, and every second that Seagal remained calm only increased their unease. Then, almost as if sensing the collective gaze of the crowd, Seagal's presence seemed to grow even larger. People stepped closer to get a better view, some craning their necks, others whispering predictions about what he might do next. Children stopped playing in the nearby park, and shopkeepers leaned out of windows, curious. This was no ordinary confrontation. This was a spectacle. Have you ever seen someone handled unfairly by authority? Comment below and tell me, what city or country are you watching this from? The officer who had slapped him tried to regain composure. You need to leave this area immediately. He barked again, his voice shaking slightly. But even as he spoke, it was clear the confidence had left him. Seagal's calm authority had shifted the power dynamic in an instant. Seagal took a slow, deliberate step forward, not threatening, not aggressive, but commanding attention nonetheless. The subtle movement drew every eye. Bystanders leaned in, cameras zoomed, and the tension became almost palpable. You could feel it in the air. A dangerous, electric quiet. Another officer, younger and less experienced, whispered something to his colleague, clearly unnerved by the calm demeanor and the controlled intensity Seagal exuded. Their strategy of intimidation was unraveling. Every bystander, every person filming, and every whispering spectator now seemed to side with the quiet authority radiating from him. And then Seagal spoke again, this time with a voice that carried over the growing murmurs of the crowd. You may think you have power here, but I assure you, your assumptions are mistaken. The statement was short, but the effect was monumental. The officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to escalate or retreat. Meanwhile, the crowd's reaction intensified. Phones were raised even higher. Social media notifications began buzzing as people live streamed the encounter. Some bystanders could barely contain their awe, whispering to friends, "I can't believe how calm he is. He's in complete control." In that moment, a subtle tension emerged. A quiet, almost invisible battle between impulsive aggression and calculated composure. The cops had acted hastily, but Seagal's measured patience forced them to reconsider every move. Their confidence was cracking, and the audience could see it with every twitch, every hesitant step. As the seconds stretched, anticipation built. People were holding their breath. Every onlooker sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. The air was thick with expectation, and it was clear Steven Seagal wasn't reacting recklessly. He was preparing for the perfect moment. The kind of moment that would leave both the crowd and the officers stunned beyond belief. And at that moment, just before the first hint of action, everyone watching could feel it. The power in stillness, the authority in calmness, and the inevitability that what Steven Seagal did next would instantly change the game entirely. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The crowd held their breath, their phones aimed and recording every subtle movement. The officers who had arrived with aggressive confidence were now visibly shaken. Their bold display had crumbled under the sheer presence of Steven Seagal, whose calm composure seemed to radiate authority far beyond his stature. Seagal remained perfectly still for a moment, letting the pause stretch longer than anyone expected. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, scanned the officers with a quiet intensity. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger. It was command. The kind of command that only comes from someone who knows exactly who they are and what they're capable of. Then, without warning, he opened his mouth and spoke, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade. "I'm the new chief." The words were simple, short, definitive, but their impact was instantaneous. The officer who had slapped him blinked, his mouth half open, unable to find a response. The other officers froze, their confidence shattered in an instant. The crowd gasped, whispering to one another, their excitement growing with each passing second. Phones clicked frantically, capturing the historic moment. There was a collective intake of breath. People stopped in their tracks. A woman behind the first row whispered, "Did he just say that?" While a teenager muttered, "No way. He's the chief." Even the officers, who moments ago had believed they controlled the situation, were now reduced to stunned silence. The declaration didn't come with threats, gestures, or aggressive posturing. It didn't need to. Seagal's calm, unwavering voice carried authority so naturally that it left everyone, including the cops, questioning their assumptions. His words resonated not because of volume but because of conviction, presence, and undeniable command. A brief ripple of laughter escaped from a bystander, but it quickly died down as the reality of the situation sank in. No one had expected such a response, and the officers certainly hadn't anticipated their own humiliation being so swift and complete. The balance of power had shifted entirely in mere seconds. The crowd's energy was electric. Everyone could feel the tension between authority and the unshakable presence of a single man who refused to be intimidated. Cameras zoomed in on Seagal's face, on the subtle tilt of his head, on the calmness that seemed to emanate from his very being. It was a moment frozen in time, surreal yet thrilling. If you were in the crowd witnessing this, what would be your reaction? Would you be shocked like the officers or impressed by Stephen's confidence? Comment below. The officers began to exchange nervous glances. Their earlier aggression had dissolved into confusion. They shifted their weight, whispered among themselves, and hesitated to make another move. Each passing second amplified their realization. They had underestimated the man in front of them. Seagal took a deliberate step forward, not aggressively, but with the subtle authority that made every movement commanding. The declaration of "I'm the new chief" wasn't just words. It was a challenge, a recalibration of power, and an unmistakable signal that he would not be intimidated. People in the crowd began to cheer quietly at first, then louder, as the realization sank in. A group of teenagers who had been recording began shouting, "He owns this. He's the chief." Even seasoned bystanders who had seen confrontation before were caught off guard by the audacity and control Seagal displayed. Meanwhile, the officers struggled to regain composure. Their commands faltered, their confidence wavered. They had expected fear, submission, or even panic. But none of that came. Instead, they faced a calm, calculated authority that left them questioning their own judgment. The crowd began murmuring, speculating about who Steven Seagal really was. Some recognized him instantly as the martial arts legend and action star, but few expected him to exude such commanding authority in real life. Others whispered, "He's not just famous, he's untouchable." Seagal's calm eyes locked onto the officer who had slapped him, and for a brief moment, there was silence so heavy, it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The officer's posture shrank slightly, the weight of his mistake evident to everyone. The crowd collectively leaned forward, sensing that the next moment would be crucial. And in that charged silence, the declaration had done its job. The cop's arrogance had been stripped away in an instant, replaced by a mix of regret, confusion, and awe. The crowd's energy surged, their excitement amplified by the realization that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Steven Seagal, with nothing but calm confidence and a single statement, had completely turned the tables. The air had shifted. The slap, intended to assert dominance, now seemed like a reckless mistake. The officers, once brimming with confidence, were frozen, their aggressive posture replaced by uncertainty. Steven Seagal stood perfectly still, his calm demeanor radiating authority so subtly, yet so powerfully, that it was impossible to ignore. The crowd could feel it. A quiet tension gripped the street, punctuated only by the occasional whisper or the shuddering of cameras. People held their breath, captivated by the scene unfolding before them. What had started as a simple, reckless act by the cops had transformed into a public spectacle of control, patience, and undeniable presence. The officer who had delivered the slap looked around nervously, sensing the weight of every eye on him. He had assumed the man in front of him would react with fear, submission, or even anger. But Seagal's calmness left him second, guessing every decision he had just made. The other officers were no better. Their commands faltered, their voices lost their edge, and their body language betrayed the creeping realization that they had underestimated him completely. Seagal's eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, scanned the group with a quiet intensity. There was no need for aggression, no need for threats. His mere presence was a statement, a reminder that authority is not just about uniforms or badges, but about the command of self-composure and respect. Each subtle movement he made communicated control, a slight tilt of the head, a measured step forward, the slow exhale of a breath. Every gesture was calculated, deliberate, and commanding. Around him, the crowd had begun to murmur. Phones recorded every second, capturing the moment in vivid detail. "Who is this man?" a bystander whispered. "He's not afraid of anyone." Others nodded in agreement, sharing their astonishment with friends and strangers alike. Even the officers began to sense the shifting tides. Every hesitant step they took, every whispered instruction to one another, was a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer in charge. The tension stretched, each second amplifying the officers' regret. The slap had been a display of power meant to intimidate. Instead, it had exposed their own misjudgment. The energy in the street had completely shifted, and the officers' previous authority now felt fragile and superficial. Seagal finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. "You made a mistake," he said quietly, almost conversationally, "and now it's time to correct it." The words were simple, yet their impact was monumental. The officer who had slapped him visibly flinched, unsure how to respond. His colleagues exchanged nervous glances, their confidence shattered in an instant. The crowd, sensing the turning point, leaned in closer, some audibly gasping, others whispering their disbelief. Cameras zoomed in on the officers' reactions. Sweat beaded on a few brows, hands twitched nervously near belts, and mouths opened and closed as if to speak, but no words came. They had expected to control the situation, to command fear, or at the very least submission. Instead, they faced a man who didn't respond in anger, but in unshakable authority. A presence so commanding that it forced them to confront their own errors immediately. The crowd's excitement grew, the anticipation electric. People whispered predictions, speculating on what Seagal might do next. Some thought he would finally retaliate, strike back in some cinematic display of martial skill. Others sensed a subtler, more powerful resolution that his calm, composed demeanor alone would humble the officers. As Seagal's eyes locked on the officer who had slapped him, a brief silence fell over the street. The moment was tense, heavy with expectation, as if the very air had thickened. The crowd, once simply spectators, now felt like witnesses to an unfolding lesson in authority, respect, and control. Then, with a subtle shift of his stance and a measured step forward, Seagal conveyed more power than any yell or threat ever could. The cops realized, fully and completely, that they were in the wrong. Their impulsive aggression had backfired, and the man they had tried to intimidate had turned the entire situation on its head, without a single act of overt violence. Every onlooker could sense it. Steven Seagal was not just reacting. He was in command. The slap that had started the confrontation now felt almost absurd in retrospect. The officer's mistake was glaringly obvious, and the crowd's reaction, part awe, part disbelief, made it clear that this moment would be remembered for a long time. The realization hit the cops like a cold wave. Their authority had crumbled. The balance of power had shifted entirely in the space of mere seconds. And the man standing calmly before them, unshaken, unafraid, and utterly composed, had done what few could. He had turned their aggression into his own display of authority. The street fell into a tense hush, the kind of silence that precedes history being made. Phones continued to record, cameras clicked, and the crowd waited, holding their collective breath, knowing that whatever came next would leave everyone talking for days. The air was thick with tension, heavy and electric, as Steven Seagal stood calmly before the group of officers who had so foolishly tried to assert dominance over him. Their initial arrogance had vanished, replaced with visible uncertainty, shaky stances, and whispered exchanges. What they had expected to be a simple show of authority had turned into a public spectacle, and the street had transformed into a stage where true power was quietly but unmistakably displayed. Seagal's eyes scanned the officers slowly, deliberately, as if reading their thoughts with precision. The crowd could feel it, the quiet intensity of a man who didn't need to shout to command obedience. His presence alone altered the atmosphere. It was no longer about the slap, the aggression, or who wore the uniform. It was about composure, respect, and control, and Seagal had both in spades. Then he stepped forward, each movement deliberate, controlled, and purposeful. There was a grace in his motions that contrasted sharply with the jittery, uncertain postures of the officers. The crowd instinctively took a step back, sensing the shift in power. Every camera, every smartphone was trained on him. Every pair of eyes followed his subtle, commanding gestures hanging on the weight of his presence. "You made a mistake," he said again, his voice calm, but now carrying a weight that brooked no argument. You assumed power over a man without understanding who he is, and assumptions like that come at a price. The words, though simple, resonated like a strike of lightning. The officer who had slapped him looked down, shame creeping across his face. His colleagues shifted uneasily, realizing the gravity of their error. There was no yelling, no physical retaliation from Seagal, and yet their confidence crumbled completely. The balance of authority had been inverted in mere moments. Seagal paused, letting the silence speak. The crowd, sensing the climax of the confrontation, held their collective breath. Every onlooker understood that the lesson unfolding before them was profound. Authority isn't defined by aggression, badges, or intimidation. True power lies in confidence, control, and the ability to remain unshaken in the face of provocation. Then, with an almost imperceptible smile, Seagal added, "I am the new chief." The words landed like a thunderclap. Cameras flashed furiously, capturing every shocked expression. The officers' faces drained of color. The officer who had initiated the slap could barely lift his head, caught between embarrassment and disbelief. The crowd erupted into whispers, gasps, and muted cheers. Phones recorded every second, broadcasting the moment to the world instantly. Seagal's calm declaration had done more than just correct a mistake. It had turned the tables entirely. The officers, previously brimming with confidence, now realized that they had underestimated a man whose authority and presence demanded respect. Every hesitating gesture, every tremor in their stance was proof of their sudden and complete regret. The crowd's energy shifted from tense anticipation to awed admiration. Spectators whispered to each other. He didn't need to fight. He didn't need to yell. He just owned it. Children who had been nearby paused in fascination, while adults leaned closer to catch every detail. Even the more skeptical bystanders couldn't deny the effect Seagal had on the entire scene. Seagal, standing calm yet undeniably powerful, let the realization settle over the officers. There was no gloating, no unnecessary aggression. His victory was measured, precise, and in full command of its impact. The slap that had started the confrontation now seemed like a distant memory, an error easily overshadowed by the quiet authority of a man who had mastered control over both himself and the situation. The officers finally began to take cautious steps back. Their earlier aggression had backfired spectacularly, and the lesson had been made painfully clear. Respect, as Seagal demonstrated, could not be demanded through force. It had to be earned, or in this case, demonstrated with calm precision and unwavering confidence. Meanwhile, the crowd buzzed with excitement. Every phone recorded the moment. Every conversation around the scene repeated the unfolding drama, and every person present understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. This was not just a man asserting himself. This was a masterclass in composure, authority, and the power of calculated action. As Seagal stood tall, unshaken and composed, one could sense the finality of the moment. The confrontation that had begun with aggression had ended with complete and undeniable authority, leaving both the officers and the crowd fully aware of the lesson they had just witnessed. The street, once tense and uncertain, now felt alive with the energy of awe and respect. Steven Seagal had turned a reckless act of aggression into a display of measured control, ensuring that the officers, and everyone watching, would never forget the lesson he had delivered. True authority is quiet, calculated, and commands respect without a single act of unnecessary violence. By now, the crowd had completely shifted. What started as a tense, almost frightening confrontation between Steven Seagal and a group of aggressive officers had transformed into a public spectacle of awe and admiration. People whispered, laughed nervously, and pointed their cameras in every direction, trying to capture the moment that would undoubtedly make headlines worldwide. The officers, who had once approached with arrogance and aggression, now looked small and uncertain. Every twitch, every hesitant movement, every glance exchanged among them spoke volumes. They had underestimated the man standing before them. Seagal, however, remained calm and composed, standing tall like a pillar of quiet authority. There was no gloating, no unnecessary display of force, just presence. Around him, the crowd was electrified. Phones and cameras recorded every second, live streaming the encounter to the world. Social media notifications began buzzing, as spectators uploaded clips and photos, sharing their astonishment with friends, family, and followers. "You won't believe what just happened," One person whispered into their phone. Steven Seagal just turned the entire street upside down. A group of teenagers had climbed onto a nearby bench to get a better view, their excitement audible as they whispered and laughed in disbelief. He didn't fight back. He just commanded the situation. One exclaimed, "I've never seen anything like this in real life." People in nearby shops peeked out of windows, joining the growing crowd, phones raised, capturing every angle. Have you ever seen someone stand up to authority with confidence? Share your story in the comments below. We want to hear it. Meanwhile, the officers tried to regain some semblance of control, but it was futile. Every move they made was hesitant, every word uncertain. They had entered the situation with the assumption of power and authority, but that illusion had been shattered. The slap intended to intimidate had backfired completely, leaving them in a state of visible regret and confusion. Steven Seagal remained perfectly composed, his calm demeanor amplified by the chaos around him. He didn't need to shout, and he didn't need to act aggressively. Every action, every pause, every glance conveyed authority in a way that words alone never could. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention and respect without demanding it. The crowd began to murmur, speculating on what would happen next. Would he finally retaliate physically? Would the officers apologize? Or would he leave the scene, letting the weight of their mistake sink in fully? Everyone seemed on the edge of their seats, their attention riveted. And then the realization spread. Steven Seagal had already won. He didn't need to strike, shout, or intimidate. His calm control, his measured words, and his unshakable presence had accomplished what aggression never could. The officers were humbled. The crowd was amazed. And the moment was captured in perfect clarity by every phone and camera around. As the crowd continued to record and share, social media began to buzz with anticipation. Clips of the incident circulated within minutes, spreading across platforms at lightning speed. Millions of viewers would soon see the confrontation play out, commenting on the astonishing calm and authority Seagal had displayed. People shared the videos with captions like, "Watch how one man can turn the tables with just confidence and composure," and "True authority doesn't need violence, it needs presence." Spectators in the crowd began comparing the scene to movies, martial arts legends, and historical showdowns. Everyone recognized that this wasn't just an ordinary confrontation. It was a real-life demonstration of power, intelligence, and control. A lesson in respect, patience, and calculated action. The officers, finally recognizing the full weight of their mistake, silently backed away. Their faces betrayed humiliation, their uniforms offering no shield against the lesson they had just received. Steven Seagal, meanwhile, remained composed, acknowledging the situation, only with his calm presence, letting the officers' regret and the crowd's admiration speak for him. The street, once tense with aggression, was now alive with excitement and energy. The crowd cheered quietly, exchanged amazed glances, and continued recording. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment that would not be forgotten anytime soon. Every click of a camera, every uploaded video, and every live-streamed clip contributed to the viral storm that was about to sweep across the internet. People everywhere, from different cities and countries, would soon witness how one man's calm authority could turn a reckless act into a lesson of respect, presence, and control. By now, the incident had reached a level of notoriety that no one could have predicted. Phones were everywhere. Cameras had captured every angle, and social media notifications exploded as people shared, reposted, and live-streamed the confrontation. The street where Steven Seagal had been slapped became an instant landmark in the digital world, and within minutes, clips of his calm yet commanding response were being watched by millions. The footage showed everything: the reckless slap, Seagal's unshakable presence, his deliberate steps, and the climactic declaration, "I'm the new chief." Every movement, every word, every pause had been recorded, replayed, and analyzed. Millions of viewers were commenting on how the situation had been turned on its head, and discussions about authority, composure, and respect flooded social media feeds across platforms. News outlets began picking up the story. Headlines screamed across screens. Steven Seagal turns the tables after unprovoked slap, and martial arts legend teaches officers a lesson in calm authority. Analysts debated the incident on live broadcasts, praising Seagal's poise and quick thinking. Clips went viral in different countries, shared by fans, casual viewers, and even celebrities who marveled at the masterful handling of the situation. Meanwhile, back on the street, the officers who had acted impulsively were left humbled. Their arrogance had crumbled instantly, and the weight of their mistake was visible in every movement. Some tried to maintain composure, but it was clear that the lesson had been learned. The crowd's energy had shifted entirely. Awe and respect now dominated the atmosphere. People cheered quietly, clapped, and whispered about what they had just witnessed. Steven Seagal, however, did not gloat. He didn't raise his voice or mock the officers. Instead, he stood calmly, a living embodiment of patience, control, and authority. His presence alone conveyed the message. Respect is earned through composure, intelligence, and confidence, not force or aggression. The crowd could feel the power in his calm, and they recorded every detail, knowing that this was a moment to remember. The viral response online amplified the lesson even further. Clips were shared with captions, emphasizing humility, authority, and self-control. Fans commented on the lesson learned, that reacting impulsively or with aggression is never the path to true respect. Across social media, hashtags like #RespectAuthority, #Steven Seagal, and #CalmWins flooded feeds. Memes, short clips, and reaction videos spread rapidly, making the story a global conversation. Even beyond social media, people began discussing the incident as a lesson in leadership. Corporations, schools, and organizations used the viral clips to illustrate the power of calm authority in moments of conflict. The story of how Steven Seagal handled the unprovoked slap became more than entertainment. It became a case study in poise, patience, and turning a tense situation into a commanding display of presence. And then, as the world watched, a simple truth became undeniable. One man's composure could outshine an entire display of aggression. Steven Seagal had taken control without striking a single blow. He had demonstrated mastery over himself and the situation, and millions of people had witnessed it. His message was clear. Strength is measured not in force, but in how you carry yourself when faced with provocation. If you believe confidence, composure, and quick thinking always win over aggression, smash that like button, type respect in the comments, and subscribe for more epic real-life stories like this one. Share this moment with your friends and remind the world that calm authority beats reckless aggression every time. By the end of the day, the story had gone global. Millions had shared, commented, and debated. People from different cities and countries expressed awe at the way Steven Seagal had handled the situation. Even weeks later, clips continued to circulate, inspiring discussions about respect, authority, and the power of remaining calm under pressure. This was not just a viral moment, it was a lesson in mastery, in controlling one's own presence, and in turning even the most reckless provocation into a moment of undeniable authority. And as viewers watched, shared, and discussed, one thing was clear: Steven Seagal had transformed a slap into a global lesson on composure, intelligence, and power.